PhD and Pearl Productions, this is PhillyCentric. One story, told a week at a time. The Philadelphia Execution. A true story of murder and American justice. By Dave Emmi. Episode 5. Deliberation Division. Last week on PhillyCentric, an initial jury room vote was taken. 11 jurors voted the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. I was the sole holdout, voting not guilty. In my view, the initial vote was just a preliminary assessment to see where we all stood. There was no way I could convict him on all the charges after having only deliberated for a few hours. We ordered lunch and agreed not to talk about it while we ate. Lunch was from a local deli, and I was fairly ambivalent about it. Some people, like Brian, were specific about their orders. With his food, he requested a Dr. Pepper with no ice. Others specified that salt, pepper, ketchup, and mustard packets must be included in our lunch. Jen was also somewhat specific about her order, but that was understandable considering her pregnancy. I just ordered a hoagie and a Coke. Subliminally, I thought, some of these people will take all the time needed to make a specific detailed request for a delicatessen lunch. But they are ready to take a vote right now concerning a case that lasted days, determining the future of a young adult after only deliberating for a couple of hours. It has been my experience that people can be quick and cavalier about making decisions that could have an enormous impact on others. But when it comes to deciding whether their lunch drink has ice or not, they'll take all the time that's needed to get it right. It reminded me of an episode of Seinfeld, where selfish egocentrism usurps social conscience. I still thought we had some deliberation work to do. I think several jurors thought the job was done and from this point forward was a waste of time. An obstinate, bleeding heart was holding up the show. To me, up to this point, we barely even spoke about the defense's case. Inflicting the severest punishment the Commonwealth will allow on a juvenile, all based on the testimony of a single eyewitness who is no Mother Teresa, seemed like a rush to judgment to me. It appeared I was the only one who thought that way. After we finished our meal and threw out the food containers, I took the forefront of the deliberations. I said, "Since I am the only holdout, I want to share with you my thoughts at this stage. For me to move to a guilty vote, I feel like I need something more than the testimony of one individual with a criminal record who is presently on probation. If there was some other piece of solid evidence to corroborate her testimony, that would go a long way for me." I continued by saying, "There was no murder weapon recovered. Maybe we should talk about the gun, shell casings, bullet and bullet fragments that were recovered." I didn't think there was anything to exonerate Bryant Childs in these specific aspects of evidence, but I was searching for something other than what solely came out of Linda Manley's mouth. There was also a bit of ambiguity regarding the murder weapon, the bullet that was removed from Stephen Smith, and the shell casings that were found around the crime scene. The murder weapon was never recovered. The round lodged in Stephen Smith was consistent with a 35mm revolver. The shell casings around the victim were 9mm. There were also fragments found around the crime scene that couldn't be matched to any weapon. The defense made a vain attempt to paint these findings as inconsistencies, but they were easily explained by the ballistics expert and the prosecutor during closing arguments. The 9mm shell casings were already there, as many of them are littered throughout Chester. Stephen Smith was likely slain by a 35mm revolver that did not emit shell casings. Tim responded emotionally by saying, All we have was what was presented to us, and that is enough for me. I replied, look, I think the defendant is clearly implicated, but I'm just not sure beyond a reasonable doubt as of yet. As far as the defense's case goes, I don't think they really had a case. Their witnesses were either not credible or provided testimony that did not exonerate the defendant. I don't think we need to spend much time with the defense's case, or what I'll call Part B of this case, but I'm not sure that Part A, the prosecution's case, went beyond a reasonable doubt. Maybe they dragged a shitty case before the jury prematurely. It was one of the few times I used vulgarity. With Tim being emotionally boisterous, I felt I needed to crank up the rhetoric a notch to hold my own ground. Sometimes being too level-headed in the face of emotional extremism can make you into a doormat. My comment about the defense case prompted some input from other jurors who up to this point were fairly quiet. Jen said, I feel the defense witnesses were really bad. The defense offered 3 primary witnesses. The 15-year-old younger brother of Bryant, Randy Childs, Bryant's 17-year-old younger sister, Tamika Childs, and a neighbor who lived a few houses from the scene of the crime and knew both the victim and the defendant. Bryant's siblings were not at all credible. They mumbled in street vernacular, and there were numerous inconsistencies in their testimonies. They were not passionate about providing an alibi for Bryant that night. They had a very matter-of-fact demeanor and appeared to be obviously lying to try to get their brother out of jail. Their story was that both of them were asleep on couches in the living room the night of the murder. At around 2 a.m., they both heard Bryant enter the residence through the front door that opened into the living room. They claimed that Bryant sat down for a brief moment and then went upstairs to his bedroom. The whole family was then awakened by a phone call around 4:30 a.m. that indicated that Stephen Smith had been shot. Bryant's siblings testified that he came down from his bedroom to answer the phone. The newspaper described Randy's testimony as follows.
Also during yesterday's proceedings, Randy Childs, Bryant Childs' 15-year-old brother, testified. On the night of October 7th, he fell asleep on the couch in the front living room, watching television, he said. At the time, the Childs family lived in the 300 block of West 4th Street, about a block and a half away from the murder scene. The younger Childs awoke twice during the night, once when his brother Bryant came home around 2 a.m. and another time when the telephone rang to tell the family of Smith's death. On cross-examination, he said he didn't recall what he and his brother talked about when he got home. The defense focused the testimony on the one entrance-exit to the house through the living room. Randy Childs said both the stairs to the 2-story building and the front doors made a lot of noise. He said he would have heard his brother if he left the house to go out.
The Childs lived maybe a 5-minute walk at most from the crime scene. Even if the siblings' testimony was true, it didn't provide Bryant with a solid alibi. The children's testimony had other statements that also were hard to believe, like they dozed off and went back to sleep once Bryant went upstairs to bed, meaning that brother and sister spent the entire night sleeping on the living room couches for no apparent reason. They claimed that they would have awakened if Bryant had left again because the stairs and the front door squeaked, and the back door was bolted shut and could no longer be used as an entry or exit. To ensure that a house only has one entrance and exit also seemed implausible. The whole thing was far-fetched, and they didn't come off as being sincere or passionate about their brother's innocence. First, Tamika said the stairs didn't squeak. Then, when told that was inconsistent with what Randy had testified to, she reversed herself. Multiple inconsistencies of that nature made their testimony implausible. But even if it was deemed credible, it didn't provide a solid alibi for Bryant. He could have left, committed the murder, and returned home in plenty of time to answer the phone call they claim came at around 4:30 a.m. The only other tangible defense witness was a woman in her early 30s who seemed credible and lived a few houses away from the crime scene. She stated that she remembered the night vividly because it was the night that her daughter had her first period. She testified that she brought her daughter to the upstairs bathroom to clean her up. At that time, around 2 a.m., she saw a group of men behind the houses hours before the murder. She said, "They're always shooting out there," so she wasn't alarmed when she had heard gunshots. Sometime later, when the police arrived and a crowd gathered around the body, she came out of her house to see what was happening. She said she brought her daughter with her to, quote, "see the dead body," unquote. I couldn't surmise if she brought her daughter out to see the body to give her a lesson about what happens on the streets at that time of night, or if it was just horrendous parenting. Regardless, it was then that she had looked across the street and saw Bryant Childs sitting on a step, crying with his head in his hands. Even if this testimony was true, it didn't exonerate Bryant from being at the crime scene. I think the strategy of the defense was just to make an attempt at bringing other people into the area to introduce some level of doubt in our minds. This witness seemed credible, but her testimony was insignificant to the heart of the case. Bryant Childs, the supposed innocent defendant, was not called by the defense to testify to his whereabouts and actions on that night in question. As in all criminal cases, we as jurors were not to give any weight to the fact that the defendant did not testify during our deliberations. We all understood this and did our best to follow the jury instructions. That said, we are also human and prone to make unconscious inferences, even though we consciously attempt not to do so. Commenting on the defense case, Jen continued, "I thought they would have had a better case if they had just rested after the prosecution rested. I didn't find their case credible in any way." I responded by saying, "I agree, but the defense isn't obligated to put forth a good case. They didn't, no question, but they didn't have to. I have a few friends who are defense attorneys, and at times they put on a case because they want to make the appearance for their clients. They want to look like they're doing something to earn their pay, so they put forth a case. If a juror buys some of the doubt that was attempted to be introduced, great. If not, nothing ventured, nothing gained." I never bought the defense's case for a minute, but I also never thought that mattered. To me, this whole thing boiled down to whether the prosecution proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Larry then stated, "True, Dave, but if your brother was on trial for first-degree murder and you were certain he was innocent, wouldn't you provide a more convincing and passionate testimony?" Larry had a point, and I never really thought of it in that light. I just discarded the defense's case almost immediately after hearing it and gave it no weight to either side initially. Larry's comment helped to bolster the prosecution case for me, but it still wasn't enough. Bryant's siblings were just children. It was hard for me to gauge a lot from their demeanor. That said, I didn't come away after hearing their testimony that it was credible and bona fide. They told improbable stories with inconsistencies that had to be pulled from their mouths, and even if true, didn't exonerate Bryant. I took a moment to explain to the group a tool I occasionally use to apply quantitative measures to vague, esoteric, qualitative terms like reasonable doubt. I took out a pad of paper and drew a line that had a 0 on one end and a 100 on the other. The line was crossed by smaller lines in increments of 10, much like a ruler leading up to 100. I said, "To be absolutely certain is to be 100% certain. Knowing that the sun will rise tomorrow is a 100% certainty. To be 99.95% certain, to me, is a virtual certainty. I can be virtually certain that it won't snow tomorrow in June, but maybe sometime in the history of recorded weather it snowed in Philadelphia in June. For me, reasonable doubt means I'm somewhere between 85 to 92% certain of the defendant's guilt. If I'm only 80% certain of his guilt, that means there's a 20% chance or a 1 in 5 probability that he is innocent. And to me, that is tangible, reasonable doubt. I don't think my tool did much to give anyone cause to pause and rethink their decision, but it did help to illustrate where I was and how I was feeling. I continued by saying, I also found Linda Manley very credible, and her testimony alone gets me to somewhere around 80% certain of his guilt, but I need more, hopefully from some other source that corroborates her statements to get me beyond a reasonable doubt. No one else was buying into that logic. A few eyes rolled, a couple of frustrated sighs were let loose, and I was feeling a level of pressure and impatience from the group. There was no way I was going to cave into it. I knew that I may never see these people again, and I felt no long-term obligation to them. I needed to be satisfied not only with my vote, but also the logic behind how I got there. If I voted guilty and wasn't absolutely certain of my vote, from a detached, linear, reasoning perspective, I could have remorse on my conscience for the rest of my life. Being the only holdout, I felt obligated to continue. I didn't want to monopolize the deliberation, but it really all came down to me. Many thoughts were rushing through my head. The jury room was also getting stuffy. Bathrooms were located in the jury room, so we really couldn't escape that environment if we wanted to. There were court-appointed employees who sat outside of the room, making sure no one could leave. I can fully appreciate the necessity to ensure that a jury is isolated and not tainted by outside influence. But if those measures are necessary, and I believe that they are, then more effort should be put forth to make the room as comfortable as possible, at least as far as the room temperature is concerned. Maybe that's one of the objectives of the system, not to make jurors too comfortable so they feel a need to move towards a decision. I don't know. There was just a feeling of being trapped in a stuffy environment. Maybe that's good and bad at the same time. The only exception to this rule was when Carl and Ellen went out of the jury room to catch a smoke. We had to get permission for this, and when it happened, we did not deliberate. It was about 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and I wasn't to a point where I was convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, and I also felt that we didn't deliberate long enough with the stakes as high as they were. If there were 3 personalities that exerted a disproportionate amount of influence on our deliberations, they were Frank, Tim, and myself. I've already shared my mindset, but let me offer my thoughts on Frank and Tim. Frank was a military man and thought and acted in a structured way. He thought that if you believed Linda Manley, then the case was over. There was black and white with Frank, and not a whole lot of gray in between. In fact, those who tried to think in terms of gray or other colors weren't thinking properly according to Frank's mindset. I was in agreement with Frank more than I was in disagreement, but just as I had wanted to avoid an emotional decision, I also wanted to avoid a decision brought about by following a predetermined thought methodology. I've worked in information systems for quite some time, so I have a well-developed appreciation for structured thinking. That said, I'm not a slave to it. Frank was. Interacting with an individual like Frank was fine for me as juror number 3. I ran across his type all the time. They want to follow predetermined steps. As a juror, I could look past Frank's dedication to structured thought. But as a jury foreman, I didn't want to give that approach an undue amount of influence. I thought about the history of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and Ben Franklin. Pennsylvania was a British commonwealth for almost 100 years prior to joining the union of other colonies to form the United States. Many Philadelphians at the time, known as Tories, were loyal to their British fatherland. The Union Jack flew in this British colony, and its British citizens paid tax to the British Crown. People like Ben Franklin had the autonomy to think outside the box and to question Britain's right to tax the colonies. He felt the colonies were financing British imperialism in other parts of the world, and that this practice should stop. Sure, his forefathers were British citizens, paid British taxes, and lived in a colony founded by the English. The rule book said he should conform to British political protocol. Franklin and others like him questioned this adopted methodology, and that was how the American Revolution started. Franklin's son, William Franklin, was the governor of another British colony at the time, the colony of New Jersey. His son remained loyal to the British crown, and it caused an estrangement between father and son that lasted for the rest of Franklin's life. Loyalty to one's fatherland is indeed a passionate emotion, and neither Franklin nor his son reconsidered their respective positions. William Franklin was arrested by the rebels and was deported back to England, where he spent the rest of his life. The son lived and died by dictated protocol. The father didn't, and the estrangement was never resolved. Tim had made numerous vitally important points, but they were made through a cloud of charged emotional rhetoric. He often monopolized conversation, letting his emotions get the better of him, and as a jury foreman, that concerned me. I didn't want the group bending to the will of any one person. That said, he made some excellent observations. It was like listening to a great rare Beatles song on a car radio that had lots of static over it because the station was a long distance away. Juror number 3 could deal with this. It's a common trait amongst the locals. Philadelphians are emotional, proud, expressive, and have a blue-collar work ethic. Bob Hope once made a joke while visiting Philadelphia that went something like, "It's great to be here in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, and if you don't like it, someone will kick your teeth in." Tim was Philadelphia through and through. Juror number 3, Dave Emmi, liked that passion and wasn't swayed by the inflammatory rhetoric. However, jury foreman Dave Emmi was concerned that a single juror was monopolizing deliberations, trying to press his own reasoning and conclusions upon the other jurors. Considering that I was the only holdout voting not guilty, I felt I was in a difficult position. If I cut Tim off or asked him to lessen the inflammatory tone, it would look like I was trying to promote my not guilty position. I gave him a lot of leeway, but he was just taking all the rope given to him and was monopolizing the deliberations. At one point, I cut him off and asked him to temper his emotions. Like a true Philadelphian, Tim resented that. Emotions were escalating, and most of the venom was directed toward me, either verbally or non-verbally. Sometimes when I spoke, people got up and left the table. Some avoided direct eye contact with me. Others just shook their heads. Still, I felt like we hadn't deliberated enough, and I wasn't going to vote guilty solely based on the testimony of Linda Manley. I didn't know Linda Manley personally. In fact, if I did, that would prevent me from being able to serve as a juror. She seemed credible, but she had a repeated criminal history and was presently on probation. If this was a civil insurance case about a broken window, maybe her testimony would be enough. But not only did I feel that there was not enough evidence based solely on what she testified to, I didn't believe our criminal justice system was structured in such a way as to put a juvenile away for the majority of his life based on what a person with a criminal history on probation had to say in an hour's worth of testimony. If a single, possibly credible, eyewitness is all that is needed to find guilt, then ballistics, detectives, and all other components of a case are unnecessary. I didn't buy into the, quote, if she said Bryant did it, and you believe her, then he's guilty, unquote, mentality. Eyewitness testimony, particularly at night, is extremely unreliable, whether the witness believes they are accurate or not. I don't think any of the other jurors thought this way, but I did. This is totally speculative on my part, but I think the other jurors saw the case as two sides, the defense and the prosecution, and we were to vote on the most convincing side. The idea that the entire proceeding may not be warranted at this juncture, due to a lack of evidence, thereby finding the defendant not guilty, not innocent but not guilty, wasn't a thought they considered or gave much weight to. I did. No murder weapon, no motive, two criminal eyewitnesses, one of which was not credible at all. We still had some deliberating to do, but I was the only one who thought so. My opinion of the jurors' dispositions at this point, at about 3 p.m., were as follows. Frank. Sitting next to me, on my left, he was frustrated with my approach. He had his chair pushed back away from the deliberating table and was rocking it on two legs against the wall. He made the comment that, quote, I have a friend from Europe coming into the airport at about 7, and I am supposed to pick him up. But if we need to stay past that time, I'm okay with that, unquote. Juror number 3 didn't give a shit if he had a private audience with the Pope at 7 p.m. We had a task at hand, and if it took 5 more minutes or 5 more weeks, he was in it for the entire ride. Jury foreman Emmi was ticked off that he made that comment. It put unnecessary pressure on the group. I wanted to put him in his place and tell him that we didn't need to hear about other outside commitments, that we all have them, and bringing them into the room was not helpful. I held back, not wanting to escalate tensions. The tension was so thick between Frank and I, you could cut the air between us with a knife. Brian. Brian was kind of like Frank light. He approached the deliberation in the same methodical way, but he was slightly more open-minded than Frank. He said he was planning on going on vacation with his family next week, but he was more than willing to cancel it if need be. He stated it in a tone that was respectful to the group dynamic. Larry. He had a bit more empathy with my thought process, but his mind was solidly made up regarding the defendant's guilt. Linda Manley struck an emotional chord with him, and he bought everything she said, hook, line, and sinker. In his mind, it all started and ended with Linda Manley, and he wholeheartedly believed her, so that was the end of it for him. Still, he respected how I felt and wanted to work with me through my independent approach to the matter. Marianne. She didn't say much, but had a positive disposition. She was professional and controlled, but endearing at the same time. Marianne mentioned she had a headache and thought she might be coming down with a fever. Jen gave her an extra-strength Tylenol. I think she was so appalled by the horror of the crime that it made her feel a bit ill. She was convinced of Bryant Child's guilt. Jim. He was taking in the experience, but not offering much. His arms were folded, and he was weighing what he heard, but he was convinced of the defendant's guilt. His typical pose was sitting just slightly back from the table, slouched in his chair ever so slightly, head cocked at a 45-degree angle, looking downward, eyes looking down, listening to what was being said and evaluating it. Jim was being Jim, quietly competent. Vince. At times, Vince was chatty. He talked about how life in Chester was entirely different than how we live. He said he had to walk through the town one night to the train station, and he thought he might not get out of there alive. Vince was from a generation and a place that was more ethnically segregated than my life experience. In the prime of Vince's life, the Italians lived in one section of town, the Irish in another, the Polish in another, and the blacks in another. Vince offered some valuable input that only a man with his years of experience could offer. I suspect some racial extremists might think a few of his comments had a tinge of bigotry to them. Maybe they did. I think it was more of how a high school educated guy in his late 50s spoke. Carl. He was the most stoic of anyone. He thought the defendant was guilty immediately, and we were just wasting our time deliberating. At times while I was talking, he got up from the table and walked around towards the front entrance of the room. His mind was made up, and he didn't need to hear much else. He said, "If you think he's guilty on the first count, murder, then he's guilty on all of them. If not, then he's innocent on all of them." Carl wasn't a deep thinker. Jen. She thought he was guilty, but she wasn't happy about feeling that way. She empathized with the irreparable damage caused to both families. She paid particular attention to the people sitting in the audience of the courtroom. She felt she knew who the defendant's mother and sister were, as well as the victim's family. I didn't pay much attention to any of that. I wanted to focus on the testimony and evidence, and I didn't want to feel empathy for anyone who was not on trial. Ellen. She was a bit emotionally shaken. She took a couple of smoking breaks and had a look of sadness in her face and eyes. She felt bad for all the parties involved in this terrible crime. I wasn't helping matters by dissecting the evidence piece by piece. It was like replaying the gory scenes of a horror movie over and over again, and my approach was taking its toll on everyone, but maybe particularly Ellen. Tim. He knew Bryant Childs was guilty, and he got his lather up when he spoke about it. His mouth moved fast, and his face would get red, and he would work himself up. It was all so obvious to him, and anyone else who thought differently about it was wrong and needed to have their head examined. Tim would offer some valuable insights, but to absorb them you had to overcome his overbearing nature. He was getting impatient with my deliberate approach. Dick. I think either Dick or Larry most empathized with me. At times when Tim ranted, Dick would shake his head in mild disdain. Tim would use inflammatory, racially charged statements, and it struck both Dick and I as being inappropriate. At times, Tim would mimic black accents and talk about those people in a derogatory tone. That type of language wasn't helpful to us reaching a decision. Dick said that he had initially felt indecisive when he entered deliberations, but now he was convinced of the defendant's guilt. It appeared to me that all roads ran through Linda Manley. Take her out of the case, and it would be nearly impossible to get a conviction, in my opinion. With that in mind, I tried to think out of the box. I said to the group, imagine if Linda Manley did not testify and was not a part of this trial. I would like to ask each one of you how you would vote under that circumstance. 9 of the jurors could not convict Bryant Childs if Linda Manley did not testify. Jen said her viewing of the crime implicated Bryant Childs, but the intimidating phone call was the clincher for me. You wouldn't make a call like that unless you were guilty. Dick and Vince added, if you were innocent of a crime, wouldn't you be pleading with Linda Manley? Wouldn't you be trying to convince her how she was wrong? You wouldn't offer to bribe her if you were innocent. Only Tim and Frank may have still been able to convict without the testimony of Linda Manley. At this point, suggestions were made to get some evidence from the trial. Frank and Brian suggested getting the enlarged map of the crime scene. Jen and Dick added that the photos of the crime scene area would also be helpful. Tim also added that we should ask for the detective's sketch of the crime scene. This was an important additional item, and without Tim, I would have not have thought to have asked for it. During the trial, Detective Slotnick read from the sketch, but we as a jury did not see it. We saw it for the first time in our deliberations, and for me, it would add some important additional information. I tore off one of the pages of the lined yellow paper pad, ripped it in half, and wrote out the request for these materials and signed and dated it. I was instructed to request materials in that fashion by one of the court employees during our lunch break. I knocked on the jury room door, and the court employee sitting outside of the room took the paper. I felt we needed to dissect Linda Manley's testimony piece by piece. She was the critical path in our logic. We talked about where specifically the car was parked when she initially left to go to the mobile station. She said she returned to the same parking spot, so a detailed analysis of the crime scene and where she was parked was called for. One thing that was never mentioned in the trial, which I found its exclusion to be profound, was the eyewitness's ability to see the crime scene in the dark, early morning hours of October 7th. I would imagine that for any crime committed at night, where eyewitnesses are involved, the witness's ability to see the crime is a matter immediately investigated by both the defense and the prosecution. Even if a witness was adamant in the identification of the perpetrator, I would think in most instances the defense would bring up the fact that it was at night, so some doubt of identification due to the lack of light may exist. Bring it up, run it past the jury. What is there to lose? Maybe it will induce doubt in some juror's mind, even in the smallest degree. Yet that point was not raised by either the defense or prosecution. Its absence was very odd, at least to me. The retrieval of the evidence items took a bit longer than I expected. I wondered if both sides were making arguments to the judge regarding the request. Regardless, it took about a half hour for the materials to arrive to the jury room. The enlarged map of the crime scene was propped up on a chair in the corner of the room, elevated so we all had a good view of it. Some of the crime scene photos were propped up against the wall at eye level on a small ledge where some electrical cabling likely ran. The photos kept falling from this ledge, so some were kept on the conference table, and the ones that didn't fall remained on the ledge. The detective's sketch of the crime scene was a single piece of paper, and it was placed on the conference table. All jurors took a closer look at it. It sketched out the location of the body, its distance from the edge of the curb, the entrance to the alleyway, and other nearby landmarks and similar types of detail. When we examined the crime scene photos, it was obvious that the crime occurred almost directly under a street light. When we looked closely at the enlarged crime scene map, there were small red dots on it, not viewable from the jury box during the trial. They indicated where the streetlights were located in the proximity of the crime scene. The murder was fully illuminated. A closer examination of the map of the crime scene also indicated that Linda Manley was parked just a few feet from the shooting. She couldn't have missed it. It was right in front of her, under a streetlight. She also personally knew Stephen Smith and knew of Bryant Childs. She testified that when she turned right onto Bain Street from 3rd Street, she waved hello to Stephen Smith just minutes before the shooting. She stated that when she entered her car initially, Bryant Childs approached the car and looked at her through the passenger side window, and they had made eye contact. I was getting the additional information I needed to get beyond a reasonable doubt. Yes, all these matters were linked to Linda Manley's testimony, but not all of them were her testimony exclusively. The enlarged map and pictures of the crime scene were the other sources that provided me with information that supported her testimony. She just said that she clearly saw the murder, not that it occurred under a streetlight. To this day, I wonder if the prosecutors intentionally left out that detail to give us a feeling that we discovered something in our deliberations. I'm sure the defense kept away from the whole streetlight topic intentionally. It only would have bolstered Linda Manley's testimony. For me, Linda Manley could either be telling the truth, telling a partial truth, or lying. She could not have been unknowingly mistaken or confused. For her to tell a partial truth just didn't make sense. She had too much to lose by testifying against Bryant Childs and nothing to gain. In her testimony, when she was asked why she immediately called Detective Slotnick after receiving the call from Bryant Childs, her reply was, "I feared for my children's safety and for mine." No deal was made with the prosecution enticing her to testify. There was too much of a risk to have 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the truth pool. For her to be lying also didn't fit. She looked genuine, as if she was under stress while she testified. She also had children who could be put in jeopardy. She had moved from the address she had lived at when the crime took place, and I wouldn't be surprised if that move was prompted by her decision to testify. The only thing that could be used against her was her prior criminal past and the fact that she was currently on probation. Dick said, "If they dug into anyone's past, they could come up with something." Tim added, "Dave, you want her to be Mother Teresa, but in that place there are no Mother Teresas. Just about everyone has some kind of criminal record." Vince added, "Anyone could write a bad check. So she shoplifted. Maybe it was for food for her children. Regardless of her criminal past, I felt that her criminal background did not rise to the level of undermining her credibility. I had to conclude that she was truthful. To do otherwise would be unreasonable. If I concluded that she was being truthful, then I had to believe that she saw Bryant Childs kill Stephen Smith. Her proximity to the crime, the illumination of the crime scene by a street light, her identification of both of them prior to the crime were the additional elements that I needed to find Bryant Childs guilty. A logical, emotionally detached, structured approach was used to come to my conclusion, and it wasn't the structure specifically cited to us at the trial. We discovered the streetlight element and thoroughly weighed all matters related to her credibility. We are now all in agreement. I went over my logical thought process, how I felt she was credible, but the fact that it all occurred under a street lamp and that her car was just a few feet from the crime scene led me to reasonably conclude that her testimony was true. That being the case, Bryant Childs shot Stephen Smith. It was the breakthrough the 11 others were waiting for, and an unspoken feeling of relief went through the room. For the first time, all 12 of us were in agreement. However, I knew there was still more to deliberate, and I had a feeling it was not going to be a smooth ride for me. PhillyCentric, a verdict is reached.